you a message or on chat, so to let you know.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Okay. So we shall start. Hien, please broadcast us. And then Mariama, all to you now.
All right. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Muy bien. Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time and considering to join this webinar, which is very timely for us. All of us globally have been in the same or similar, maybe not identical situation of this global pandemic that's wreaking havoc across communities, especially the most marginalized and the poor communities in all of our countries, and those workers who are not fortunate enough to have leave, to have sick leave, to have electronic mechanism that allows them to continue working, and those who must work because they're frontline workers and frontline communities who are suffering hard from this difficult time. So the Gender Trade Coalition, APDWL, has put together this webinar in this time. It's the first in a series of webinar that's been organized by the Gender and Trade Coalition. So it's a coming out of sort for the coalition, which was formed roughly in 2019, though on the development before that of women's organization and organizations with gender advocates and advocates who are working on gender equality and women's empowerment, with a focus on international trade to interrogate, to do advocacy around making sure that trade policies do not exacerbate the pre-existing discrimination and biases that women face in communities, small and micro enterprise, women traders, women in household, women workers in export-oriented or even in import competing sectors. We're all impacted by trade. So we have a lineup of speakers, and I won't belay the point. We have an hour and a half, maybe now an hour and 20 minutes to go, and we'd like to have some interaction with you, the audience, the global audience, to share your perspective, your insights, and what's going on in your regions or your countries. So I will say a little bit more about the network later on as we go along. But right now, I would just like to dive into the session. We will have translation for one of our participants, Nayaret from PSI from Chile. And so that will help us a lot. So we're very thankful for APDWL for arranging that, and for the translator. Let me say my thank you now, in case we got carried away with the session and forget to say that. We really appreciate your effort, and we know that translation and translating in this context can be quite a challenge. We all speak with different accents, different language, different tonalities, and some fast, some slow. I will try, and we will try to keep that manageable so that Naya, you can follow the conversation and the translator can also follow the translation. Okay, so let's go. Our first speaker is from the Women in Migration Network, which is very, very timely and important, because migration is one of the fundamental challenges that we will face, and that we will face with climate change, that we'll face with the COVID, aftermath of the COVID crisis, and the economic crisis that will ensue. We'll have issues of internal migration inside countries, as well as international cross migration. And so the work of the WIM has been very powerful in following the UN processes and doing advocacy on behalf of migrant women and migrant workers everywhere. So Leopoldo Peco, who's based, well, she'll tell you about her and where she's based, so I will leave that there, will lead us off sharing her perspective on how these trade agreements impact women, and what are the advocacy that's being done, kind of the landscape of what's going on in terms of international trade and international rules governing commerce broadly. So we look forward to hearing more, and we will have about 10 minutes for each presentation, and I'll try to do minimal intervention so that we can have a full 40 minutes or so of intervention with the audience. I'm going to turn the mic now over to Leopoldo.
Thanks, Mariama. Good to see you and good to see everybody, albeit virtually. As already introduced, my name is Lebohang Diepolopeku. I'm based in Johannesburg, and I'm sitting here representing the Women in Migration Network. Part of my other capacity in my other day job is I'm also a senior research fellow at a movement think tank called the Trade Collective. And it's in that capacity that I really think that I'm going to segue my remarks on the Beijing platform perspective, including a piece on the lack of intersectionality, the gender blindness of the macroeconomic framing, and of course the blindness in relation to labor rights and migrant women and displaced people in general. So I'd like to lead off by saying that, and I hope I'm not going too quick with the translators. I'm mindful, as you said, Mariama, that we have different accents, and I'm also mindful that I'm trying to compress a lot of ideas in a short space of time. But I think the one thing to say as a lead-off is that the Beijing Platform of Action is really a series of contradictions and contestations. So like many internationally led agreements and protocols, it really came off the back of a lot of really hard political feminist work over the years. And what we see is a series of compromises. The same can be said about the Beijing platform, but it is to say that in its final form, it and of itself is not really intended to be a structural instrument. And I think that many feminists and women's rights practitioners tend to anchor of advocacy, create autonomy and some constancy, right? Neoliberalism in the understanding of states, of markets, and really underlying assumptions about how economies and international trade works, and how movement of people also functions as a buttress and as a funnel for capitalism and for the low-waged, low-protected, and often even no-waged, no-protected workers, most of whom globally are women. So this strange binary and the strange interface between mainstreaming as an instrument of which the Beijing Platform of Action is one of the pillars of gender mainstreaming machinery globally, and neoliberalism helps us to explain the really rapid diffusion of reform in organizations and the really statist underpinning of the Beijing platform. It also helps us to understand how so many of these states, which are really associated with neoliberal, very orthodox, very conservative macroeconomic agendas, have been unwilling or even unable to move forward at a significant pace on many of the structural demands that the Beijing Platform of Action tries to make of them. I think the second part of this is to say that this also represents this proliferation of state bureaucracies, which are also trying to lead gender mainstreaming. So again, it's that really tough tension between the ground up kind of work that many of us on this call and on this panel are engaged with, and the top down policy diffusion, which is really driven by transnational networks like your UN system and other NGOs like WHO, ILO, and by states. So a very statist attempt to try to deal with grassroots issues. So it's probably quite naive for us to hope that these kind of efforts are going to lead to a transformative change, but I do think that they do represent the opportunity for us to call for greater inclusivity, and I think also to call for greater feminist intersectionality, which leads me to my third remark. So when we read the original 12 demands, which speak to women in poverty, education and training, health, violence against women, women in the economy, armed conflict, and so on and so forth, it's interesting that they're all dealt with very separately, and yet one has to appreciate that none of them can work without the other. It's difficult to deal with women in the economy without at least even a buttress of human rights, without understanding how states function and how states are even conceptualized. So one of the suggestions and one of the critiques that I'd like to make, and I'd like to invite us to make, or a provocation, would be around the really non-intersectional, and then as we're looking at the 25 years, the lack of intersectional analysis of any of these priorities, and looking at this really as and suggesting that feminist knowledge generation and dissemination should be the real priority in this Beijing +25 process. I think the fourth point I'd like to make is around the monopoly of data and data analysis, particularly gender segregated data. That's been a real bee in my bonnet. And we really, I think going forward, especially, I don't know what post-COVID looks like. I don't even think there's going to be a post-COVID. I just think that we're going to be in this moment in different ways and forms for at least a few years yet to come. So I think in this COVID moment, in its ongoing textures and in its ongoing contours, I would really suggest that it's an opportunity for us to support evidence-based policymaking, and the evidence is all around us. The mobility patterns, the education and health outcomes, and which are exactly the reason why there's high levels of morbidity, especially among Black, brown women in this COVID moment, and especially the deconstruction of states, which is exactly what has led to the lack of adequate health care, both in the global north and in the global south, the austerity and the deconstruction of public utilities and public services as part of what has occurred in this. So encouraging gender desegregated data would also help us to track the kind of basic information, including movement of people, death, birth, marriage, and to track in a longitudinal way population trends and changes. But I think that a full understanding of the significance of gender in the case of macroeconomic analysis really needs us to redefine the realm of analysis. So in gender analysis, an economic system is really conceptualized in terms of the different activities that make up the three spheres, right? So that's your production, that's your finance, and that's your reproduction, which is typically characterized, I think, slightly problematically as the care economy. So that's your reproductive, domestic work, chores, both paid and unpaid, and the work that takes place, which is often unrecognized in and out of the household to enable the market economy to function, to thrive, and to produce itself. Because it is often characterized and associated with women, we then minimize it and call it care work, and I think it's much, much deeper and more profound than that. So this is linked to things like transformation of goods and services, where the finance refers to these activities that are involved in the circulation of ownership and aggregated wealth. And by contrast, reproduction, as pointed out here, includes all the stuff in between. Now, what has happened, of course, in this COVID moment is that we've recognized that there's a huge confluence between productive and market economics. Many of us are caring for our children, schooling, we've become school teachers, domestic workers, we've become nannies, we have become cooks and chefs and all sorts of things. And we're doing all of this while concurrently, continuing with our work in the mainstream economy and doing work such as this. And I don't think I'm the only person who tries to pretend and dress up my room and hide my pajamas and all of that, because this is the extent to which we are forced to be in multiple places and spaces at the same time. This is where women in work always have been, but this COVID moment exacerbates this. Now, I think that it's also worth then just highlighting kind of a few of the things that the Beijing Platform of Action and some of the recommendations that have emerged as a result of a lot of the active women that I respect, even on this panel, have done. And I think the one would be a suggestion of modifying macroeconomic policies that are going to, going forward, address the structural causes of poverty and reduce feminized inequalities. The second is reprioritizing public spending decisions so that they in future can address social, educational, and health needs, particularly indigent communities, working class, and even non-working class, unemployed, and people who don't have any form of regular income. I think as well that it's quite important to think around ensuring that national policies that are related to trade agreements can take into account gendered impacts. They can absorb gendered impact, and that transnational corporations going forward are forced to comply with domestic laws and regulations rather than being privileged over national sovereignty and national policy space, and often over national, the workers' rights and women's rights in those countries. I think that macroeconomics policies' impact on women's rights is glaringly absent from most of the analysis of progress in the Beijing Platform of Action, and it has really left us with incredibly difficult impacts of capitalist market-led or economies on women's rights, which are quite ignored. And this dominant model has substantially shaped both the national and the global macroeconomic policy. And it's been supported by instruments by the Beijing Platform of Action. And I'd like to suggest that they're supported in this regard, specifically because these instruments are not meant to be structural. They are actually ways of elongating or at best creating an uneasing tension between existing neoliberal market orthodoxy and the kind of ground up transformative change that many of us are trying to work towards. I think also in coming to my conclusion that we should also be thinking around the gendered impacts in both crisis and recovery, particularly gendered employment patterns, reconsideration of what work actually means, redefining what work means, the gendered patterns of parallel work and parallel economies, again, I think sometimes mischaracterized as informal work, the role of women and migrants and undocumented workers, the gendered dimension of the global supply chain, and the focus and cover of the first wave of economic recovery measures. And I'd like to suggest that we need to look at structural inequality and the political economy and state power, and that we need to look at the kind of tax regimes which going forward restructure regressive tax systems through increased property taxes, corporate taxes once this recession or this movement ends, and develop different programs that address homelessness, that address food insecurity, that address hunger, lack of access to health, and so on. And I think I'll leave it there for now. There's a ton more to say, but I think we can take it up in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very broad landscape of issues that you've pointed out, including the structural deficits of relying on the structural deficits implicit and explicit in the Beijing platform. And we are mindful that that's a negotiated instrument within the UN, so we don't expect it to do other than it's done. But I think what you're calling for is that we use this moment of the Beijing +25 to galvanize global civil society, particularly women's movement, because at this moment is one of the most glaring moments where we see inequality, injustice, we see the role of women, social reproduction, care, the abdication of care by the state, and now all of that care comes back into the community. Women are the ones who are in the nursing, teaching sector. They're also doing the same thing at home, even while they're doing the Zooms and the web and the WebEx and the various kinds of things. So this moment, I think you're pointing out rightly, represent a galvanizing moment for us to point out these glaring inequalities and to point out that these documents, including the Beijing +25, have been insufficient and inadequately done. And so we need to have definitely more revolutionary positions taken, and we need to push those states who are friends of gender to take much more stronger and dynamic and progressive, radically progressive agenda moving us forward. So thank you. I think the global audience, and we have over 100 persons, 112 now on this webinar, begin to get a glimpse of the power and the possibility of the members of the Gender and Trade Coalition, the incisiveness, the analytical brilliance of this network, which is it's a feminist alliance for trade. It was launched in 2018, and all of the organizations who are a speaker here are a member of that, including others. PSI definitely, that network in the UK, Third World Network, Africa, and many, many, many. And we'll see more of their names as maybe when we have the open and answer questions. But it's a powerful organization working to make sure that trade rules are just and equitable and fair, and that linking up with our brothers and sisters who are working on climate justice to make sure that the transition, whatever that transition, including the transition from COVID, is one that serves the points of view, perspective, and needs of those at the bottom, who are primarily our sisters and brothers in developing countries and in vulnerable population in Europe and the US, Canada, North America. So now we're going to bring in another perspective. Oops, I think I just, okay. We're now going to go to, sorry if you permit me a little bit here, we're going to go, we're going to go to Nayara, who will touch upon trade impacts on public services, what this means for further under the current pandemic, and how this is likely to play out. So Nayara, or is it Nandini that should be here? Sorry, I'm looking at two different instructions here. So actually, I think it's Nandini. So Nandini, you're going to come in and discuss digital trade policies in the new area of contestation, if I've got that right.
Hi, so friends from APWLD, if I can have my slide deck up, I can go.
So is it Naya now? Can Naya go ahead? Or are we waiting for Nandini? Again.
Nandini?
Yeah, hi, I'm just waiting for APWLD team to pull up my slide deck, and here we go, and thanks for that. Friends, today I'm Nandini. I'm from IT for Change. Our organization works at the intersections of digital technologies and society. And I will be speaking from the work that we do on the Digital Justice Project, a collaborative initiative with the Dawn Network. And without much ado, I will just sink into the presentation. And today I'm looking at why digital trade contestations matter for women's rights and in this moment of the pandemic. Next slide. So we can see that despite the global recession that has set upon us, a particular sector of the economy is doing very, very well. And that happens to be digital trade. So just look at this data on this slide. So as the WTO itself observed in May 2020, the pandemic has provided a boost to the business to business and business to consumer online sales of physical goods and digital services in key sectors such as education, health, and media. And if you look at the statistics here for the United States, India, and China, major markets, you can see that e-commerce is here to stay. Next slide. What we have to remember is that the boost to digital trade is not really a boost to the millions of medium, small, and micro enterprises and them finding new digital marketplaces online. It's actually a boost to the US and Chinese big tech. So in the short run, what have we seen? We have seen a strong growth in the turnover and profits of US and Chinese platforms in the first quarter of 2020 that coincides with the COVID pandemic. Jeff Bezos' wealth grew by 400% during this period, and Chinese platforms such as JD.com and Alibaba, they made a killing during this period. Big Tech has continued its project of acquisitions in critical markets. Facebook is investing in e-commerce platforms in India and in Indonesia. And Financial, the Chinese Big Tech, is continuing to invest in Myanmar in financial technology sector at the height of the pandemic. And in the long run, what will this mean? This will mean that the essential utility infrastructure of commerce finally ends up in private hands. Next slide. We have to remember that such big tech dominated trade, it does not work for women's rights. And why is that? So when major platforms come in, there is actually a livelihood squeeze for women entrepreneurs and producers, and there are stories and evidence from across the world. And what are the reasons for this? If you are a small and micro women-led enterprise, you will not be able to afford the steep rates of commission, and the terms of participation often go against you, as the experience of SEBA, a women's cooperative in India, has shown. Oftentimes, in Amazon, we know that the majority of sales happen through the buy box slots, but nobody knows which products get the buy box slot. And similarly, no one knows who gets TripAdvisor discounts, right? The workings of the algorithms that determine product placement and discounting are opaque and not available to the retail partners of these platforms. Worse, there is data theft of markets by these platforms, where these platforms will first partner with small enterprises in the local market, understand the domestic intelligence very well, and then undercut them by launching their own private labels or running their own parallel dark store networks. And in the middle of the pandemic, like we saw in the first slide, when there has been an increase in food commerce, we will see a trend where e-commerce is re-engineering food supply chains end to end. And this will mean the corporate paradigm of agriculture that has never worked for small and marginal women farmers, you see a return and consolidation of that. The NGO Grain that works in Indonesia has already been pointing to how Alibaba's forays in this direction in Southeast Asia bodes very ill for the livelihoods of women farmers. We are seeing similar trends after the COVID period in India, where Flipkart, the local e-commerce platform, is trying to get into local food supply. Next slide. And then at the macro level, we know that there is an erosion of the tax base. And this, of course, means the care infrastructure investment will go down, and women's burdens will rise as the economy becomes increasingly digital. In 1998, countries had agreed to a moratorium on customs duties on the trade of digitized products and services. And this moratorium is renewed every 2 years. But over time, as the share of digital services has gone up, we see that developing countries stand to lose out a lot, and over 95% of the tariff loss from this moratorium is borne by developing countries. We also see that physical presence-based taxation models do not work, and there has been an exploration of services presence-based tax models. But the US retaliates. Just 3 days ago, the US is thinking of launching an inquiry against 10 trading partners, including EU, Brazil, and India, which have launched digital services taxes proposals. And they will, of course, impose retaliatory tariffs, and there will be problems about this. And worst of all, data resources are colonized by US and Chinese platforms, which means that developing countries will get locked into the low-value parts of the digital economy and not have their own indigenous pathways to growth in this period. And this unequal political economy will affect women, because in the context of trade, we know that women's rights are can be discussed only in the context of development justice. Now I come to my final slide. Next slide, please. We see that against this backdrop, the digital trade policy proposals that have been put forth at the WTO and through plurilateral agreements, they are actually an attempt to entrench the status quo and reinforce the unequal global order. Despite the pandemic, plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce have continued, and there are over 70 countries negotiating this. And here the game is really between the US stance and the China stance. What US wants, because most of its big tech are digital services companies, they want to protect their market interests through enforcing these rules. That the customs duties on digitized products and services, the moratorium that exists on this, they want to make this permanent. They want governments of developing countries to never have the right to demand disclosure of source code or algorithms, without which, of course, you cannot enforce competition law on platforms, and you cannot also build your domestic industry. There are a set of proposals from them, which is essentially about deregulating digital services further and opening up these markets like wholesale, so that the developing countries get completely decimated. And then unrestricted cross-border data flows, they want to maintain this laissez-faire regime so that US hegemony is reinforced. China, on the other hand, is focused more on the trade end commitments of digital trade because it's basically looking for market expansion and access to new markets for the goods of its e-commerce platforms. And because of its own history and political location, China is opposed to the US position on data flows because, of course, China wants to control, like, how data is managed in China. So it's interesting to see how this plurilateral negotiation on standoff will finally materialize. But whichever camp goes and whatever compromise is arrived at, this bodes ill for developing countries because in neither camp can we find a solution that will further the right to development of the women of the global South. So to conclude, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Trade justice advocates have been saying for a very long time that gender justice is actually development justice, right, in this context. And if we have to think of a new feminist economy where in the data and digital technologies context, we can build social and solidarity economy models, we need to preserve our policy space in the global South, and we need to fight these plurilateral and, one-on-one FTA attempts to take away this space. So we have to be vigilant. And later, if we have time, I can talk a bit more about what will be some of the concrete policy proposals we can pursue to have a digital economy that works for women of the South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nandini. Another excellent presentation. And I think the thing that is really very important to recognize between the two presentations, one is the role of international negotiations and international agreements in, on one hand, perpetuating possibly economic injustice and economic inequality. And we see that realize a lot in the trade agreements. And so there's been a long 20-year plus push by NGOs and civil society about trade justice, into which gender justice have been a pivotal point, all on the grounds of the fact that the trade rules and trade policy tends to disadvantage to developing countries and to the poorest of the poor in developing countries who are in the trade and export sector. I think for people who have thought that digital technology was simply an arcane subject left to policymakers and technicians, I think the presentation Nandini made must show how much digitalization and the digital economy really have implications for the lives that we lead. And I think COVID has brought that to the fore because most all of us are now partaking in the digital economy in some way, shape, or form. And so that we need to work with IT for Change and other civil society groups who are really looking and following the WTO and the plurilateral agreements, trying to make sure that these agreements do not monopolize and prevent states from industrializing and from being able to have their competition laws because of the rules that are allowed to protect source codes and algorithm and other various kinds of technical things that Nandi so masterfully, mistressfully, I should say, spoke about. So that I think it behooves all of us in the gender and women's empowerment community to become more aware of these impact of these trade agreements, in particular right now on the digital agreement. And I look forward to us having some interchange and some sharp, good questionings for Nandi and some ways forward. Now we'd like to turn to another dimension that is really pivotal to the trade rules, which is services, and to invite NIRF to come in and give us a perspective of what's going on and the impact of public services, both as it's been evolving in the trade discussion, but also in terms of the impact of COVID-19, because we know that the service community, nurses, teachers, all of those people who are on the front lines have been part of this, and that's a very big part of the trade situation. So look forward to speaking with you. I must apologize to our participants. We were supposed to have simultaneous translation, but we're having problems with the technology. So I really, really, really apologize to all of you who were expecting to have this language facility, and it's not available at the moment for us. Thank you, and ask your patience and your forbearance on the matter. And now Nairat. So I think she's going to speak
Be doing
with
the
a
translation, and this
translator
is
and a
our PE.
translator.
Yep. My name is Ewan, also from PSI. I'm here in Brazil doing the translation for Nayade, who is in Chile. Because my screen in the Zoom system, so I will just ask people to right-click on Naya's screen. You can see her there with the PSI flag in the background. If you right-click on her screen, you have the option to pin the video, and that way you will see Naya, who's going to be the one that's speaking, okay? Thank you, sisters. Por favor, Naya.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night.
Today, I'm going to talk about a new study that was published by Public Services International. Some free trade agreements, specifically that the Chilean government has negotiated. There's 4 specific ones here that PSI has analyzed. The United States, with the European Union, with China, and with Japan. Consequences for gender equality in the context of these trade agreements. The objective of this work is to offer social organizations that are focused on this kind of content, give them some kind of content to defend public services and women's rights. Tools to critically analyze, contest the neoliberal policies and international trade in their respective countries. The Chilean case is unique and paradigmatic in this respect. It's one of the countries that has most actively practiced neoliberal trade policy. To date, Chile has 55 trade agreements in force. The United States with China in bilateral agreements, but also groups of countries such as the European Union and Mercosur in Latin America. The neoliberal reforms that started during the Pinochet dictatorship from 1973 to 1989, and the subsequent deepening during the civil governments that followed it in a democratic period. One of the priorities that has persevered despite these governments has been the privatization of public services, including education, health, housing. There's already a market for all of these in Chile. And so that explains why developed countries, rich countries, are signing these types of agreements with Chile because of these pre-existing markets. Many authors have shown that neoliberalism has accompanied in this sense, the growing feminist movement during the last decade has incorporated criticisms of this economic model as one of its priorities. On the other hand, it's not unusual to associate the signing of free trade agreements with these processes of privatization and increased gender inequality. On the contrary, since they are perceived as mechanisms for reducing tariffs on specific products, they don't tend to be identified by movements, social movements, organizations that defend the role of the state, that defend women's rights as real concrete threats to those interests. But taking a closer look at these trade agreements allows us to observe the close relationship between free market, privatization of the state, and gender inequality. the study has shown that one of the decisive characteristics of neoliberalism, as opposed to classic liberalism, is this understanding of the importance of legislation and the state, the role of the state in creating and securing markets. And so this opens up new forms of oppression and exploitation for women. It's important to mention this because to seriously address the effects of the neoliberal social order without addressing inequality and the violence that precedes and conditions it, such as the structural nature and oppression of women. An expression of this is that not only is the public sphere defined from a patriarchal perspective, relegating to the private the irreplaceable process of social reproduction that occurs within the home and that rests on socially unacknowledged work of millions of women around the world. But in the public sphere itself, new hierarchies are with the massive access of women to education and the formal labor market. The extent of this structural inequality goes beyond the scope of this study in particular. But suffice it to say that it affects the unequal status of men, women, the very content of concepts of masculine, feminine, unequal participation of women in social production, worse conditions for women in the exercise of rights recognized by the state, less access to the state and the public sphere, invisibility of violence against women, invisibility of reproductive work, the double working day, among other things. This inequality in our social topography must be considered when analyzing any reform or changes affecting society, as its impact will be unevenly distributed in the sexes. Thus, it is most likely that a reform that increases insecurity, job insecurity, will particularly affect women's job insecurity in a disproportionate way. And a reform that reduces the services provided by the state will most likely increase women's workloads. And that a reform that privatizes traditional knowledge in rural communities affects especially women in those communities. Are a tool of neoliberal expansion. Due to the constitutional or legal reach and the submission of their compliance to international arbitrators, any product that is allowed entry into countries without tariffs or restrictions from more developed countries implies a very significant limitation on the possibilities of local producers, private or public, to compete in their production. This economic asymmetry between the parties, between countries, is expressed in and effects of the treaties. It's replicated or reproduced. Effects that are in turn unequally distributed within the population. Invisibility and unequal distribution of domestic and reproductive work in our societies means that the adverse economic effects are particularly harmful to women, either because they're directly affected or because they're overburdened with care work that society demands of them. The double workday. That the other sisters were saying as well. The distinction between productive and reproductive work contributes to the maintenance of the labor force, and social reproduction results in the invisibility of women's work and its concentration in the reproductive or unpaid sphere. The authors of the study have pointed out that for example, maintenance of agricultural subsidies by the most developed countries and the dismantling of protection in the rest of the world has had a significant impact on the deterioration or worsening of populations in developing countries and direct consequences for women's care work. From a more general perspective, this organized poverty and precariousness refers to the dependence of Latin American economies and global economic centers, as noted in the middle of the century. Enzo Faleto and Cardoso. That's why it's not unreasonable to state that in the context of free trade agreements, the dominant and dominated economic interests in a given country can clearly be, they're exposed, they're seen, they're visible. Each economic sector will fight for the opening or protection of certain sectors and goods according to their own interests. People do the same depending on their development model. So the content of a free trade agreement expresses the power relationship between the signatory countries. Unfortunately, all of these treaties that were analyzed by PSI don't say anything specifically about women's rights. There is one agreement, one paragraph, one little section, but in the agreement between Chile and the EU, the treaty begins with an extensive list of areas of cooperation between the countries, between the signatories. There's more than 50 articles of cooperation devoted to this cooperation will look like, and among them, Article 45 is entitled Cooperation on Gender Issues, and it says, cooperation shall contribute to strengthening policies and programs aimed at improving, ensuring, and increasing all sectors of political, economic, social, and cultural life. Okay, this is a positive statement, this is a positive thing, but it's not connected or linked to any kind of concrete measure that the parties should implement or should use to make it real, to make it effective. As with many areas of cooperation listed in the treaties, like the environment or workers' rights, consumer protection, they don't have any kind of obligations on the parties. They're not enforceable through the dispute settlement mechanisms included in the treaties. So in this way, the contrast is made very clear with respect to the clauses that are the real priorities in these kinds of agreements. The structural nature of the oppression of women in our societies means that, yeah, they're just declarations. So the structural character of oppression of women in our societies means that no measure of the scope or extent of a free trade agreement is neutral. It either increases inequality or expressly addresses it. So of course, only treaties or free trade agreements that start from an understanding, a recognition for a component of our societies, and that analyze their own clauses, the own clauses of those agreements in this light and in this context of structural inequality, and that establish specific and binding measures to confront it, will be able to contribute to the fight for women's rights. In this context, it's important to mention that COVID-19 has exposed the enormous vulnerabilities and injustices of the new world capitalist system, where these free trade agreements are produced. We have a health system that's been systematically weakened by austerity measures and private to all, and workers suffer and have suffered both racial and gendered discrimination. At this moment, it's extremely important to transform this moment, this experience, with united health systems, sufficient financial, material, human resources, systems that are well regulated, and above all, oriented to promote quality public health with a structured, gendered approach. Because we understand that there can't be any kind of transformation, real transformation of the world order, without transforming that oppressed us into something new, a new normal that recognizes, supports, and shares our collective burden of reproductive work and care in our health and social systems, with public services that respond to the needs of both men and women, equal access to and treatment in labor markets, and zero tolerance for gender violence. Never has this phrase been more true. The future will be public and gendered, or it won't exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nayar and Yuan, our translator. Thank you very much. And once again, I do apologize to our Spanish speakers who were anticipating having simultaneous translation of all of the discussion. And we are having technical problems, and the next time we will have worked this out differently. Now, public services and services are one area that are critical. We know it's critical, essential to humans' life and to lives, in particular women, especially women who are not able to afford to pay for care, who must do their care work at home, and care work in the public sector as nurses, doctors, and other professional teachers. And we know that from the COVID, one of the aftermath of the COVID will be that there will be pressure on the public services of developing countries, because there will be more pressure to seek doctors, nurses, and teachers who are exported services from many of our countries into developed countries where there might be depletion of their own internal process, internal service workers. So that's definitely, this is one area that's an area that we need to watch for. Those of us who are living in developing countries that are exporting quite a lot of nurses and teachers saw that even during the COVID, there were many countries who were still adverting for those services. And so it's not just at the level of paid services and the level of care services, there are tremendous amount of rebound impact that will impact women. We know that many times these trade agreements do not have provisions in them that secure the conditions of work of the women, whether they are migrant women migrating at lower levels or at higher levels of education. And so there is a tendency for exploitation in those systems. So these are the things that we also must work from. I think you also made a very important point, which is the discrepancy or discordant in trade agreements that purports to be gender friendly, but don't have any significant structural parameters that are binding, legal, or that will actually improve the condition of women. They simply have these platitudes and various kinds of things that are already existent in labor clause in the ILO convention and so forth, but they do nothing to change the structural inequality and the structural challenges of the trade agreement that impacts on development and impact on MSMEs access. And yet at the same time, if you walk around the WTO, you will be told that the reason why we need a plurilateral agreement on government procurement, on digitalization, is because it will help women. And the data is not there, and that's some of the work. So welcome the PSI study, and look forward to much more studies such as this, that will help us really to push the case that we need trade rules that are supportive of development and are supportive of women's empowerment and equality, and that just are not rhetorical, and that the rest of the trade agreement binds government and does things that unbound gender equality um, achievements while giving lip service to gender equality. Thank you very much for that, both of you, and you took very good time. Thank you. Now we turn to Diana Lahava from APWLD, who will discuss how investment agreements specifically impact or constrains government policy and decision making. And ISDS, pretty much on any webinar I've been to in the last 2 weeks, has come up because many governments are fearing that the measures that they've taken in regards to the lockdown will expose them to suits by companies and law firms. And we know already that these payouts from these tribunals are greater in many cases than what governments receive in ODA, and they will impact the debt of the government. So there's a big campaign by civil society and institutions such as mine to have a moratorium on investor-state dispute settlement, and to work to transform that whole process. Yet many of our governments still sign those agreements despite the work that's been done many years. So it would be great if the feminist and gender advocate community would begin to take that on, because that tremendous implication for provision of social service, for provision of a whole bunch of things that are important. So I won't belabor the point. I'll turn it over now to Diana. Diana?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope everybody's able to see my PowerPoint slides. So as Mariama mentioned, my name is Diana, and I'm with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD in short. And we are a feminist membership-driven network with members from all over Asia Pacific. And I'll be talking about today what we broadly call the new generation or 21st century trade and investment agreement, with a particular and specific focus on one of the larger ones, or the biggest one that's happening in the Asia Pacific region specifically, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but also recognizing that many of these new generation of trade agreements has actually a lot of things in common with one another, wherever they might actually be happening. And then looking at some of the criticisms that us as the feminist movement, as well as the social and people's movement, have had on these new generations of trade agreements and the RCEP, and how so much more this pandemic had proven the validity of our criticism, and why we really need to think and look at a new trade system that cannot be the same as it was prior to this pandemic. So in Asia Pacific, we have this thing where, and I think everywhere across the world as well, we have now a proliferation of free trade agreement, what we call the noodle bowl of FTAs and regional trade agreements. And this picture that I'm showing on the computer is nowhere at all capture the extent of how much agreements that are actually already out there and is still being negotiated. And when we say new generation, what does that actually mean? Well, for us, basically, these are agreements that are taking place outside of the World Trade Organization. In some and many of the agreements, I think it's with some of the speakers I've earlier shared, it's also extending beyond the rules that are currently existing in the WTO, particularly with the investment provisions, as well as the intellectual property provisions and the e-commerce rules, just to name a few. And of course, a lot of these trade agreements have been, very much criticized by a lot of human rights experts, which is basically very much concerned on how it can actually impair human rights. And that was, this is actually even an old statement that was put out by UN experts several years ago, highlighting how important it is to note the way that free trade agreements, regional, bilaterals, and so forth have a way of magnifying inequality, and how it's going to be bad for everyone, but will particularly so be bad for women and other marginalized groups, in which in many cases women consist a large part of. And so going into the regional comprehensive economic partnership, so it's basically a free trade agreement between the 10 association of Southeast Asia nation countries, along with originally its 6 free trade partners. Although late last year it saw the withdrawal of India, and that remains a question mark there that I've left there on the slide. And had it included India, it would have been a trade agreement that covered almost, basically effectively almost 50% of the world's population. And yet something that has been negotiated in total and absolute secrecy, with no participation whatsoever, no text being released. And I think we have to recognize that this is increasingly a trend of a lot of the negotiations that have taken place outside of the WTO in recent years, whether you talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TISA, PACER Plus, and so forth. So what was our previous criticism around agreements such as RCEP, as well as other similar agreements? I think some of the earlier speakers have already mentioned the domestic policy making space and how that would be constrained by a lot of governments. And what we can imagine here is the constraint that applies across every sector, not just e-commerce, not just public services, but also, your market access, your tariffs, your licensing, and so forth. And when, as feminists, we know that market is in and of by itself patriarchal, sexist, and exploitative, as well as discriminatory. And so you can't allow market to run by itself, and you do need a lot of state policies or affirmative action to at least level that playing field or address some of those discriminations and sexism and patriarchy that exists within a market when you basically let it run by itself. And yet with many of these trade agreements, we know that it will restrain and constrain governments' policy making, whether it is for affirmative action or for any other reason. And it will constrain that in perpetuity. So not just now, but for future purposes as well, until and when, if a government decides to withdraw itself, which politically is, never actually happens in trade agreements. It also, of course, certainly, has an impact on state revenue in terms of the collection of tariffs. This is particularly more significant for developing as well as least developed countries that does rely on tariffs as number one, a form of revenue, number two, a way to actually protect small, medium, local, as well as infant industry. And so on top of losing that tariff as sort of an angle or the way to kind of promote local industries or infant industry, they would not have that tariffs anymore. And then you will have, I think as some of the earlier speaker mentioned, cheap agriculture products from developed countries flooding the local market of a developing and a least developing country. And a lot of these agreements as well would actually prohibit any kind of preferential treatment that government might want to undertake to protect local businesses as well as industry, be it women or not. There's of course a lot of issues around the intellectual property rules. We call in the RCEP and other new generation trade agreements, we call them TRIPS Plus. So it's actually introducing more stringent rules than what you existingly find within the WTO system with regards to intellectual property. And then we of course have the important investor-state dispute settlement, which in the RCEP right now, there's a question mark whether it's going to be in or out. Currently it's out, but we don't know whether it will come back in. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the ISDS is basically a provision that exists in a lot of other investment bilateral related agreements that allows for foreign corporations to effectively sue governments if the government takes any action, passes any laws, regulations, or policy that affects those corporations' investments, profit, current, as well as future profits. And corporations have really used ISDS, especially in the last decade or so, to go after governments when they have made laws and policies, even when they were in the interest of the people, even when it was intended to protect the environment, even when it was intended to increase labor wages, or even like carry out affirmative action policies. So it is something that is adding to that first point, where it can really constrain the kind of action that governments can take, which then takes us into what does that mean in this time of pandemic. So obviously we know that this current crisis is not just a health crisis, it's also going to be an economic crisis. And if we're lucky and we get to wade through this health crisis, what will remain in a much more longer term will most certainly be the economic crisis. And you need governments to be able to have that kind of policy making space to make the necessary relevant policies, economic, industry, financial, as well as health, which in many of these trade agreements, governments will not actually have. And we have this really easy example about capital control, which I think many of us know that immediately after this pandemic started, something around 80 billion US dollar had flown out of developing as well as these developing countries. And capital control is quite a common step for a lot of governments to take, especially during times of economic crisis. I'm from Malaysia, for example, and my government during the Asian financial crisis had taken steps around capital control. And right now, we can see even Australia have started introducing capital control by screening every single foreign direct investment because of the pandemic. So this kind of action actually would be in violation of trade agreements such as RCEP or other similar trade agreements. So you can't have capital control. Thirdly, in what we have seen is the way the current global value chain is so precarious and so unreliable. Very early on, and even until now, we have so many countries facing actual shortages of necessary goods and products because they are relying on goods coming from abroad, and there are shortages everywhere. And then you have the buying power of some countries. So if you're a poor developing country and you can't pay that much money for masks and PPEs, then you have to wait until those goods are made available to be able to bring them in by import. So going ahead, if you are a government and you're saying that we don't want to have another mask, glove, or PPE shortages ever again, so we're going to build our own domestic industry. Under the trade rules in RCEP and other similar type of agreement, you can't do that. You can't have infant protection related policies. And so if you want to build your own domestic glove making, mask making, PPE making industry, you'll be severely constrained by the rules within RCEP. And then, of course, when it comes to intellectual property rules, there was actually a case in Italy where, because of the shortages in a particular component of a valve, a valve in a respiratory machine or something like that, a couple of startup companies decided, oh, we'll help and we'll build it using our 3D machine. And that startup companies were actually threatened by the company that owned those patents, saying that if you produce this, we might, come after you for violating our intellectual property rights. And so we really need to think of how intellectual property rules going ahead, not just for patents and drugs and industrial designs, can actually be in a way that you can ensure people can actually access these patents and so forth, and that we won't be meeting another sort of shortages if these patents are actually being shared around. And then finally, we also have, this hasn't come up yet, but of course, in many previous financial economic crisis and so forth, when governments have taken action to try and mitigate those crises, we have seen those same governments get sued by foreign corporations under ISDS. And so that has been a huge factor for many governments. Even right now, when you hear about the implications of the lockdown in many countries and what that means for foreign direct investment, and certainly it has a lot of effect, we see a lot of governments are already worried about whether those actions can actually subject them to investor-state dispute settlement lawsuits within the current trade agreement that they are part of. And so just kind of wrapping up, I think it's really important for us to, I don't think any governments out there have genuinely carried out a review process about what the current text of the agreement means in this current pandemic, how much of them actually need to change. And in many countries, and in many agreements, whether it be the WTO and the RCEP, a lot of governments are bulldozing and pushing ahead with some of these problematic agreements that they made before this pandemic started, without recognizing that a lot of that will have to change. And it's obviously taking up a lot of government time at a time when they should be focusing very much on the responses that they carry out domestically in trying to deal with this pandemic. So we do really need a new trade system. We need the current one to go away, and we also need the current one to stop negotiating. And I think it would be really interesting in this webinar and in the coming one as well that we do with the Gender and Trade Coalition for us to have that discussion about what a new feminist trade system that's just and equitable can actually look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that very detailed and comprehensive presentation on trade agreement and the investment agreements that often are part of them, as well as embedded in those investment agreements are investor-state provisions that allow for investors to be able to sue states on whatever grounds they so deem, and they have been very capricious about what they sue for, and have been getting huge sums of judgment by arbitrational panels that have no ethics. Many of them, the same person that are judging a case is sitting on the board of a company within the same sector. It's a complete lawless process. As a result of activism by civil society and many institutions such as ours, such as the South Center, there's a push to try to reform some of those processes. But we must be careful for reform never ever end up actually benefiting the people who are generally disadvantaged. So we have to really be very vigilant about that. And we must be even more vigilant in this time, because we have seen that law firms are pushing corporations to say, you know, because the government shut down this under COVID, there's a bilateral investment agreement that you may be able to sue under. So we're watching that process to see and to have proactivity to be able to secure that governments are not going to be, the treasuries won't be leaking money to these entities. I think it's very, very important, as we are talking here in the context of COVID, and the fact that one aspect of the thriving part of the global economy at this point is the digital economy, and that the services will likely pick up because of the need for exporting and importing of nurses and other professionals, that we see the real significant importance of international trade and investment agreement, because they might often seem to be very technical and very difficult, but they do impact every single aspect of our lives: what we have for breakfast, how we have access to hospitals, schools, and so on. So I do hope that the global civil society members who are in this panel will actually push our presenters with some good questions, and we could have real good strategic discussion emerging from here, if not completely solved here, on this issue, and galvanize around looking at some of these trade issues. We have one last presenter, but not least, of course, we have Michelle, and then we will open up for questions. So Michelle is from the African Women Development Communication Network, FEMNET, that's been around for many years doing advocacy work on gender equality, women's empowerment, and overall working to promote sustainable, equitable, just development in our developing countries. So I'm going to ask Michelle to come in, and she can talk a little bit about FEMNET and herself. And you have 10 to 15 minutes. Yes, we are pretty much almost there.
Hello, good day. Thank you for those that have had to wake up really early or stay up late for this meeting. I'm going to talk about the questions that women should be asking around the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'll ask 5 questions. What is the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? How do women fit in? What should we be worried about? What opportunities can we tap into, and how can we make it work for us? First slide, please. The African Continental Free Trade Area is an agreement to liberalize trade on a continental scale. Whereas trade has already been liberalized to some extent in various regional trading blocs, the Free Trade Area broadens this to the whole of Africa. It was signed at the 10th session of the Assembly of the African Union in March 2018, and it came into force on the 30th of May 2019. It's supposed to come into operation on the 1st of July tentatively. And why this agreement is important is because it brings together a huge market of 1.2 billion people and a combined GDP of over 2.5 trillion USD. So one of the major things that will come out of this agreement in terms of tariff concessions is that it has been agreed that there would be a 90% tariff liberalization by the 1st of July 2020. And over a 10-year period, there will be a 5-year transition where an additional 7% of sensitive products would have to be liberalized as well. Next slide. How do women fit into this trade agreement? Well, firstly, women are mentioned in the agreement, but very briefly in its preamble and Article 3E. So the preamble notes that it recognizes the importance of international security, democracy, human rights, gender equality, and the rule of law for the development of international trade and economic cooperation. And Article 3E states that the general objectives of the Continental Free Trade Area are to promote and attain sustainable and inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality, and structural transformation of the state parties. So it's important that at least it's mentioned. Whether this is enough or not, that's something else. And then the second reason, the second area in which women fit in is statistically, women cross-border traders constitute about 60 to 70% of cross-border traders in Africa. And their trade is usually the only source of income that they have for their families. Additionally, small-scale women farmers contribute about 70% of the labor force in the agricultural sector. And also, women entrepreneurs have an opportunity to expand their businesses and to source raw materials and intermediate goods from the region. Next slide, please. So this is not a closed list of how women can fit in, but at least it's a starting point. So now to the more critical issues about what exactly should we be worried about with this agreement coming into operation. The first of these is tax competition. With liberalization, more countries will try to attract investors by lowering their regulatory regimes and their taxes. So the race to the bottom, basically. In light of this, corporate tax is likely to be lowered. And with a reduced tax base, governments are likely to use other taxes to fill this revenue gap. So governments could do one of two things. They could cut back on spending on public goods and services, which often results in the levying of user fees for public services, such as healthcare. And this might have more adverse effects on women because governments at all levels, it's even worse now with the coronavirus pandemic, because governments are reprioritizing resources to respond to the COVID health crisis and to the socioeconomic pressures that are resulting from it. The second option that governments might take is increasing VAT and other taxes. And studies have already shown that women are more affected than men when VAT is increased because women spend higher percentages of their income on consumer goods. So this means women would be disproportionately affected by increases in VAT. So that's the first thing, tax competition. The second thing is access to credit. Among other things, women's access to land tenure limits their ability to obtain funding that requires collateral. Women often have to rely on SACCOs for credit and savings and microfinance, which further excludes them from participating in the African Continental Trade Agreement unless this is addressed. The third thing is women cross-border traders. A joint study conducted by the African Union, COMESA, and UN Women showed that women's cross-border trade is highly informal and therefore subject to high transaction costs, border delays, corruption, insecurity, gender-based sexual harassment, and poor basic infrastructure and facilities. They have weaker trading associations, and there is a lack of gender disaggregated data on cross-border trade flows. So these are things that we should be thinking about. The fourth thing is value chains. Small-scale women farmers tend to have low input, output, and low value-added goods, which might hamper their participation in regional trade. Furthermore, their effective participation in value chains is limited by the low production capacity, both in terms of quantity and quality. And the UN also notes that limited access to market-driven information and infrastructure challenges, including unequal land accessibility and an unfair commercial environment, lack of access to information, limited access to post-harvesting technologies, and the lack of export competence are all challenges that women would have to think of. In terms of public procurement, it's startling to see that about 15 trillion US dollars goes from governments to suppliers through public procurement systems every year. But of this figure, only 1% goes to women-owned businesses. There's a risk that this is unlikely to change much under the free trade area if there aren't any concerted and deliberate efforts to address this. The sixth thing is lack of capacity and trading costs. As it stands, large corporations are more likely to have a better understanding of border and customs procedures, unlike women's small-scale farmers and women cross-border traders, and this may increase their trading costs. And as been mentioned already, in terms of COVID has created serious challenges in terms of not only trade, but even the general economy in countries. A recommendation has been made to the Assembly of Heads of States to delay the trading date of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement because of the COVID pandemic. But in the meantime, the newly appointed Secretary General Wamkele Mene has noted that they're trying to work together with the African Union Center for Disease Control to create trade corridors for the movement of essential goods during this time. The eighth thing is human rights. We have to keep in mind issues of food security, labor, health, business, and human rights in general. Next slide, please. So what opportunities can we tap into? The first thing is we need a longer ladder, and we also need the tree to be straightened, right? So in order for women to benefit from increased access to markets, and access to raw materials and intermediate goods, and basically to the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we need some structural changes and substantive equality to be put in place. The draft protocol on trade and services identifies priority sectors such as energy, infrastructure, and finance, which present opportunities for men and women. There's also potential to expand women-owned businesses across borders. But some would argue that the annexure on SPS measures, which could make it easier for small-scale farmers and cross-border traders to meet export standards, might actually face challenges, because from past experiences, these are the groups that struggle the most with meeting SPS standards. So unless infrastructure is put in place, this might continue to be a challenge. And then finally, what can be done to make it work for us? The next slide, please. Well, the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will not automatically come to women, but states must create an environment and establish strategies and practices that will bring these benefits to women and women entrepreneurs, such as choosing to build women's capacity in key sectors and removing legislative and customary barriers that inhibit women's participation in trade, such as access to land, gender-based violence, and sexual abuse. If not monitored, wage gaps and occupational gaps will continue to be barriers on a wider spectrum, especially as policy space will no doubt be more limited. So priorities for the Continental Agreement should not divert from areas where women are traditionally dominant by emphasizing the activities of large multinational firms and their subsidiaries. The 10% sensitive products list should create meaningful space for vulnerable groups and strategic sectors. Preferential procurement policies should be encouraged. There should be a simplified trade regime to enable small-scale farmers and informal cross-border traders to engage in trade across borders under the provisions of the AFCFTA. There should be strong monitoring mechanisms for systematic collection of gender disaggregated data on cross-border trade flows. There should be facilitation of market links, market information, and favorable immigration. The role of local governments also cannot be overlooked, as they control access to local markets for small-scale traders and crucial licenses such as business registration, building regulations, services such as water and electricity, and childcare facilities. So municipalities should form part of the strategy to make the Continental Agreement work for women by having gender-sensitive regulations. And the last consideration is that already some committees which should have completed their work on protocols on the free trade area this month were not able to meet due to COVID-related mobility restrictions. And it's important in this context to delay the start of the Continental Free Trade Agreement to allow for further engagement, lobbying, and capacity building for women, communities, and the institutions that will be working closely with the African Continental Free Trade Area mechanism. Thanks. Thank you.
A very nice wrap up, bringing together pretty much everything that we started talking about are part of the discussion and the framework for the AFCTFA. And so you've actually brought us full circle to what it is and what are the considerations and priorities that we as gender advocates and women's empowerment advocates need to think about when we look at trade agreement or when we're advocating for changes in trade agreement. And really brought us also, thank you for starting by really graphically and concretely portraying the conditions that affect women traders, cross-border traders in Africa, within and across countries, and that the current trade regime does not do anything to eliminate those constraints and considerations. And therefore, we have to be very mindful when we're lobbying for gender to be integrated in trade agreements, what it is we're asking and what will it do for those from the bottom up, not just the middle-sized enterprise, but also the smaller sized enterprise and individual women who are part of this global value chain. And so I think this is very critical, as was illustrated earlier by Nandini, that even with digital trade, the rules favor the big companies, and even under the COVID, the big companies are pushing into sectors that are critical to our lives: food security, agriculture. And we know, again, with the investment agreement and trade agreement, that most of the essential services, as Nayarda has pointed out, are most of them are privatized, so therefore they're subject to trade rules and trade liberalization. And that has not been an accident. That's been a very clear strategy of the international financial institutions, starting with structural adjustment and the various kinds of loan conditionalities that have conditioned our countries. And now we know that many of our countries are on the brink of indebtedness, and if they aren't, they will be after fiscal stimulus for COVID, and therefore subject to more vulnerability and conditionalities, all of which are critical for impacting women as workers and in care activities and so forth. So this has been a really powerful presentation, and I thank each and every panelist brought something to the table. I see there are a few things in the chat that we might want to go to, and I don't see, and see if there's any questions from any of the participants. I see a question and answer, and there's 2 questions that I'll flag out, and then we'll see if we can open it up. We are coming pretty much against the time constraint. But there is a question from Aisha that whose focuses on internally displaced women, IDP, who face issues of rape, molestation, and they're driven out of their homes and leaving their business behind and their loved ones. I wanted to know where and what is their place to elevate their suffering. So I think that speaks to some of the issues around women and migration, but also some of the rules that we're very good at structuring, binding rules on government to facilitate the flow of capital, but less so to facilitate the flow of labor, even the ones that we so desperately need, as the COVID has illustrated. So again, some of those issues about what do we do in the case of, we can tell already that there will be a lot of issues of migration um, around some of the COVID issue as jobs flee or business don't return. And we also are aware that for many countries, in particular in my region, we are now approaching the hurricane season. And so you have the hurricane plus COVID, and you have instances in India and other places where there's concurrence of extreme weather events and the COVID while the COVID is going on. And so since we know that COVID is going to be around for a while, and it is, as Diana, I think, pointed out so clearly, it is not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis. It's not an economic crisis coming, it's actually an economic crisis right now in domestic economies where people are unable to find work, unable to find sources of living. Even in Switzerland, where I live, the lines for free food in some areas have been a most amazing thing. So can you imagine in our poorer countries where people have less buffering to be able to survive? So we'll see a lot more internal displacement as well as cross-border migration. It behoves us as activists. So I'm going to put that out there, and I don't know who will take it. There's another question. This one is specific for Diana on RCEP. What would this mean for Thailand and Vietnam that move not to export rice to ensure their domestic supply during the pandemic? And that opens up a whole nother question about trade rules that we see trade rules are being shifted about to facilitate those who are able to implement their trade rules in terms of putting on export control, when in previous time they would push developing countries not to have those export control. And many of us in our agreements may have prevented ourselves from being able to use this by signing on to things that precluded it. But now we find that even the proponents of the trade agreements are themselves using export controls for food, for medicine, and for other kinds of things, PPE and so forth. So I throw the questions up to the panelists. We have a good 5 more minutes or so, so please, anyone who is willing to start. And you can also use it as kind of your wrap up if there's any last thing you have to say, because I don't see any hands up unless I'm looking in the wrong place for participants to request on the floor. So, Deanna, what's the question to you? And I guess the question on migration, Leopoldo, and others can chime in and make last-minute presentations.
Yeah, and just to kind of point out that there's actually a couple of, for some folks who are also putting in their questions in the chat box instead of the Q&A boxes. Yeah, so just flagging that to the panelists, especially Michelle, because there's a couple of questions that's very specific to the ACFTA, which perhaps you could tackle afterwards. But I'll go into the questions that's been addressed to me. So export prohibition is something that's not even allowed under the WTO rules. And so we assume that the RCEP is building on these rules, and we're saying that because we don't have any text at all, that it would most certainly mean that it would not be allowed under the RCEP as well. So WTO does allow for some export prohibition, which actually, as Mariama mentioned, once the pandemic started, all the proponents of free trade agreement, including many of the developed countries, the EU and North America and so forth, were very quick to actually impose their own export restriction as well. And the WTO itself has registered something like over 80, I think, export-related restriction that ranges from food to medical devices, equipment, masks, PPEs, and so forth. So yeah, so there has been a lot of that, and technically under the WTO rule, it's only allowed in some exceptional circumstances, and it can only be temporary. But I think as many of other colleagues we have here as well know, and have been working with the WTO much more closely as well, exceptions in the WTO rarely work and are rarely applicable. We of course don't know whether this new pandemic is going to bring a new dynamic, and since AC exceptions have been introduced. Measures have been introduced at the WTO. You know, is it likely to start off a whole suit of like state-to-state dispute at the WTO where everybody's suing one another for numerous range of like violations of WTO rules? So I don't know. I have no idea whether that would actually happen. And then I think that's really just goes back to the importance of how even the existing rules that we have at the WTO or in other much more older trade agreements are really not good and really not what you need or what we need in this time of like a pandemic, which then just goes forth to point out that any kind of new agreement that builds onto that and expand those regulations further or tighten them even further is certainly not going to be much more better than what we've previously had. And then I am reading something on the chat box, so I'm just going to throw people as well to the chat box because Tanya Reed-Smith from TWN did mention, has shared a link to a particular WTO resource where they say that WTO allows export restrictions for essential products with critical shortages. New Zealand and Singapore have proposed at the WTO on the 15th of April a ban on export restriction for listed products. Okay, so there have been some reactions from different governments on those export restrictions that has come out. So I guess we'll probably have to see how that plays out. Yeah, and I think just to kind of add in conclusion, I think it's really interesting that we have, you know, looked at a range of different trade agreements and how they are effectively harmful for women even before this pandemic and then even more so in this pandemic. And I think it's really great that we can continue to have, this is going to be an ongoing conversation for all of us, I hope, where we continue to look, understand, learn, as well as discuss on what are some of the ways forward that we could have as the feminist movement or other social movements that are working for women's human rights.
If I can chip in on the questions that were directed to me, it's Michelle.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Michelle, go ahead.
Thanks. So I picked up about 4 questions. The first one relates to a source for the fact that VAT affects women differently from men and adversely. I can send the source to you after the meeting via email and or to the organizers so that they can share it. And then the second question is about the impact assessments done by UNECA and whether it's making any difference to the individual countries' human rights approach to the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I actually do not have any direct knowledge on how this is working in practice, but I'm aware that UNECA has conducted some studies and has publications on women and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and how they're trying to improve the gendered analysis and the gender-sensitive approach of governments. And the question came from Caroline Donen, and I think you probably have more experience in this area. I don't know if you'd want to add a few words on that, if you've got any information on that. And then the third question, in terms of transnational corporations having access in the African region, pursuant to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. As far as I'm aware, the agreement allows for and actually encourages foreign investment. So there's definitely room for transnational corporations to take part or to engage in trade and to benefit from this agreement, which is probably where some of the challenges come for women, because there's an increased risk of small infant industries or smaller producers being pushed out by large corporations that are better able to maximize this space that is being created within the region. And then there's also a question about SMEs and how women and illiterate women can be enabled to participate and to not lose out completely on the agreement. I think in that context, some lessons or best practices can be learned from regional economic communities such as COMESA, which already have in place a simplified trade regime, which allows for exactly this group of people to be able to engage in trade with easier procedures. And I think the East African community also has a simplified rules of origin procedure. So there's definitely need for capacity building, because as it stands, people that are working in the area know about the agreement, but people that need to benefit from the agreement probably have no idea that it's coming into operation and how they're actually going to use it to their benefit. So there's definitely a need there for capacity building. Thanks.
I think I'll just jump in exactly where Michelle has left off, and speak a bit about the globalized nature of migration and displacement, and that this is really about an ongoing brokenness. So the gendered economic impacts, both in crisis and in recovery, are linked to gendered employment patterns and the movement of women and movement of people. So the informalization of work and the movement of and the patterns of informal work or parallel work, the role of women and migrant and undocumented people in global supply chains, as has been mentioned, is really part of really the first wave of, I think, what should be considered as national and regional economic recovery measures. And now that there has been this renewed appreciation of what we've already known about the reproductive work, the unpaid work of health and social care, particularly the massive bias that the frontline workers, the massive overrepresentation of Black and brown women in the frontline of this, as nurses, as care workers, as doctors, as medical personnel. And by medical personnel, I include women who work as cleaners and domestic workers in medical facilities as well. The impacts, of course, of what they're subsidizing on their bodies and in their health, in their own personal health, at the expense of COVID, has not been adequately monetized or even aggregated. Hence, I go back to the insistence on gender disaggregated data to measure this. And I think lastly, that this links to the ways in which gendered coronavirus implications, looking beyond the permutations of this COVID moment. And as I say, I don't think it's a moment that's finite. It's a moment that's ongoing and that is going to be textured and nuanced for many years to come. But it does force us to then analyze health as a sellable good, health facilities as a sellable good, public-private partnerships as the ultimate and ongoing solution to part of the post-COVID, the COVID recovery plan, extremely problematic because once again, it removes states from the center of public service utility, but it also forces end users and user fees, which many people, including migrant workers and women, do not have access to. So once again, commodifying what should be basic goods and common goods. And finally, I think as well that personal and communal safety in relation to globalized workforce and the movement of that workforce and the underlying fragilities of that value chain, including the skill value chain, the human value chain, the commodities value chain, the production value chain, then necessitate us to rethink those connections between the violences of that value chain, including human trafficking, trafficking of women, trafficking of refugees, and the statelessness, in fact, of many people. So the fact that multinational corporations and transnational corporations are often privileged over human beings, over people, over workers, is something that I think as philosophically and as feminist activists, we need to be much more concerned about. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. I'm going to, I thank you very much for the panelists for their presentation and all of you for your questions. I unfortunately must bow out, so I'm going to turn over the moderation and closing out of this, the APWLD Secretariat. But it's been quite wonderful, and the Gender and Trade Coalition will be hosting a number of these seminars, and please look out for them. Deanna?
Yeah, so thank you, Mariama, for moderating. And I really want to thank folks because we've gone over time and yet so many of you have decided to stay on with us. We have a lot of really interesting conversations, sharing and chats and questions and discussions actually happening in the chat box, which is really how we do imagine our webinars happening. Because those of us who are speaking or moderating, we're not the only experts here. All of you are. All of you have a lot of knowledge, information, and resources. And we wanted this to be a space where we can share and exchange that, and that's exactly what has happened. We are going to close, but before we do, I do want to give sort of like one last word to Naya, just if you have any kind of last things to say. And okay, there was a hands up from Caroline as well, who is one of the participants and the attendees. Caroline, because those of us who are staying on, I'm grateful and you can continue to stay on. Caroline, do you still have something you'd like to say, or have you perhaps like put that in the chat box? And then we could give Naya sort of like a closing remark, and then I'll close the webinar.
Given the time, it's probably best if I communicate by email, and perhaps if we have some things to share, it can be shared by email. I hope with the presentations. But thanks everybody for your input. I've learned a lot. I've appreciated this webinar very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So Naya, one last word before I close this webinar.
Listo. Ready. Presentations were great. And how the financial crisis is affecting all of our countries differently is very clear. And there are clear consequences for public finances. We debate this a lot about the connection between the capacity of the state to tax and who's paying their fair share. And so these are collective costs that we all need to think about how we pay for. We work with the public sector, and we understand these tensions in the global economy. We have a clear analysis of this. It's fundamental that we reevaluate the role of public services, education, public health, water systems and sewage systems, because the consequences of privatization and cuts in these areas are disproportionate on women. And the benefits go to these multinational corporations, and we need to end this. We need to put an end to this. To gather this evidence and put it on the table. We know the consequences of these strategies, these models of development. When you cut the public, and that's what we're fighting against. Thank you all very much for your contributions.
Thank you so much, Naya. So finally, in conclusion, I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank the moderator, Mariama, even though she has already left us. And I want to thank all of you for staying on for this webinar, even though it's either really late or in the middle of your lunch hour or very early in the morning, wherever all of you are at. There was, as I mentioned, a lot of sharings on the chat box. So there are some really interesting things that folks who can be part of. I think very early on, one of our attendees, Ranja, had shared a letter, I think, on the investor-state dispute settlement. So please do sign on to those. Sanya has also mentioned that the WTO is now looking at a different kind of temporary interim state-to-state dispute settlement. So we need to make sure our governments don't sign on to that. And of course, there's a lot of different movements and networks that are currently in our own area, in our own region, fighting against different trade agreements that are currently happening. So if you are not yet part of the Gender and Trade Coalition, please do join us, or please do sign up to the Gender and Trade Coalition. We will have several more webinars that's going to happen between now until about August. And we hope more of you will continue to join us for those coming webinars so that we can continue to have these discussions and conversations, as well as ways to think of how can we take collective actions, carry out collective strategies to see the kind of change and a new world when we emerge